I ran across this, and I was sitting there going, man, this is probably the biggest counter-Reformation name. So, bring us all up to speed. Reformation begins technically in 1517. The Counter-Reformation really begins the Council of Trent in the 1540s. Really starts picking up speed in the 1550s, 1560s especially. And so one of the, you have Francis de Sales, the Catholic controversy, one of the big writers against Reformed theology and the Reformation, things like that. People that I read, people that we should read if we're going to be dealing with the best the other side has to present. But man, I'm going to tell you something. It's pretty rare you run into the best the other side has to say anymore. Just like it's pretty rare on our side too. It almost seems like the greater the ability to communicate, thanks to the internet, the more shallow we think. Everybody. Did you see that thing I posted in the channel? It's an AI of Joseph Smith, buffed out, clearly on steroids, and it's the Liberty Jail photograph, where he's murdered, and it's making him look like this superhero type guy. And I posted it in the chat channel, and I was like, when I first started talking to Mormons in the 1980s, this never suggested itself as something I'd be dealing with in 40 years, 45 years. It's just because there's no evidentiary value. There's just no value at all to it. It's pure entertainment. I struggle with the people that, turn Paul into a weightlifter or something like that. I mean, he clearly was, even by his own testimony, was not anything to look at. It's a generational thing. My generation's just like, ooh, that's creepy. But the youth think it's, sadly, the youth assign it evidentiary weight, like it has something to do with truth, when it has nothing to do with truth at all. Which is a problem. So, anyway, as I've been saying, it's really a burden to me most of the time to try to find a way to interact with what's going on online, simply because so much of it is just such a degradation of human intellect. No interest in truth or consistency or historicity or anything like that. Anyway, I ran across this, looks like he's a Roman Catholic priest, and he's a entertaining speaker, and he's energetic. We've all seen ministers of every religion that look like they're bored out of their minds being a minister of that religion. It always makes you wonder just a little bit. And so it's sort of unusual to see a priest who's, well, I have seen some of those priests that are really rah, 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 way too rah, 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 and that seems a little weird too. Imbalanced. But here this guy's talking, and he's talking about something that comes up in any meaningful conversation we have with Roman Catholics about the gospel. And it has to do with the Lord's Supper, Eucharist, transubstantiation, eat my body, drink my blood, John 6, all of it, 1 Corinthians 11. And there have the number of trees that have died and gallons of ink that have been spilled on this topic is epic. But ask yourself a question. If you're not a Roman Catholic, if you're a believing, let's say, Reformed evangelical, most of our audiences, have you read any sound works that have any kind of polemical content to them in regards to Rome's view of the Eucharist that were written more than 50 years ago? Have you read anything other than my books? I mean, I deal with it, obviously, in the Roman Catholic controversy, the fatal flaw, stuff like that. But have you? From our side. And even more so, anything from the other side? I mentioned Francis de Sales. Cardinal Bellarmine, probably the biggest name in the Counter-Reformation and the generations thereafter. Protestant scholars recognized he was a force to be reckoned with. And so they read him and they read him carefully. And again, when I started doing apologetics, I didn't have anybody to tell me what to do. I learned as I went along. And I just knew, they call it steelmanning today. When you present the other side in its best, strongest form. Unfortunately, what I'm discovering is very frequently what is defined as steelmanning now is presenting the argument in its most emotional form, or its most memed form, its most visual form, rather than its strongest form. That's the scary part. That's what makes me go, oh, a society that cannot think critically, a society that cannot analyze arguments, is a society that can be controlled by anybody. And that's what we're seeing. Same thing in the realm of religion. So anyway, the idea of steelmanning was just natural to me. When I finished reading all the Christian books I could find on Mormonism, I started reading all the Mormon books I could find on Mormonism. I saw all these books being cited in the Christian books, as I'm making a list, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, Mormon Doctrine, Articles of Faith, Jesus the Christ, Marvelous Work and Wonder. And so I'm going to the LDS bookstore, and I'm buying their books. Nobody told me to do it. It just seemed like, well, these are the sources, so I need to read the sources that, I'm using secondary sources, Christian responses to Mormonism, so I need to read what they are quoting from. Seemed rather logical, and, I've stuck with that. Now I could defend that as the only proper way of doing things, but at the time it was just like, if someone's going to be talking about my faith, it'd be nice if they'd read the best stuff about my faith. And so I just think I need to be consistent. It would have been a whole lot easier not to have that consistent commitment from the start. But anyway. So Bellarmine was the big lifter. He was the big Roman Catholic scholar and dealing with these issues and making arguments. And for quite some time, if you're going to be responding to Roman Catholicism back in those days, you're going to be, if you're not responding to Bellarmine, you're not really responding to what Rome was putting out. Now, most Roman Catholics don't know who Bellarmine was today. And I think most Roman Catholics would struggle with some of his argumentation. And of course, he's far more conservative than almost anybody in the magisterium today. He would be considered absolutely radical. 2 right wings instead of 2 left wings. But anyway, so that's the background of this little clip. It's all of 35 seconds. All this to get to 35 seconds. Can you believe that? But here's the clip. And as you listen to it, as you watch it, ask yourself, why do people find this attractive and faith-promoting? And if as a Protestant you're going, oh, that's shallow, here's the question. Do we do the same thing? Do we applaud when our side does the same thing? Sadly, I would say in many places, yeah. So here we go.
St. Robert Bellarmine at one point was in a debate with a Protestant about the Eucharist. And this guy, this Protestant guy got done with this whole thing about, like, it's not really Jesus, it's only a symbol of Jesus. And he gets done with this whole kind of exposition. And Robert Bellarmine was kind of a funny guy. And he looks at the guy and he says, okay, let me just get this straight. You say this is not Jesus' body and blood. Jesus said, this is my body and blood. Just, if you were me, who do you think I should believe? I'm going to go with Jesus.
You see how that is a very common internet-style form of argumentation. It does not invite critical thought. It does not invite you to think about what's the foundations of what's being said here. Because obviously, when Jesus says, this is my body and this is my blood, the issue is not that he say the words. The The issue is, what did he mean by those words? What is the context? What is the flow of John chapter 6? What is the flow of the establishment of the Lord's Supper? Why is this so relevant that it was done at Passover with all sorts of symbols all over the table that represent the suffering of the people of Israel and all the rest of that stuff? That's what the issue is, and everybody for hundreds of years after the Reformation, the plowboy, probably 100 years after the Reformation in a Protestant country, knew more about these types of arguments than most people preaching in pulpits today, on either side. And so it just strikes me that, there's music going on. I don't know if there was music going on while he was speaking. Probably not. But it just strikes me that people who are posting this, do they really think that was an argument? Do they really think that it's just, well, Jesus said it, therefore just believe it? Yeah, well, Jesus said a lot of things that require you to listen to what he actually said. I mean, I've used the example, if you really want to get literalistic, there's that one place, I think it's in Luke, where Jesus said, let these words sink deeply into your ears. That's literally what the Greek says. That's the literal translation. I use this as an example of the difference between formal equivalency and dynamic equivalency. Those are older terms now, but formal equivalency, let these words sink deeply into your ears. Dynamic equivalency, now listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Now, one is the literal translation, the other is what Jesus communicated, what he meant to be saying. And we can talk about which is best to have in a translation of the Bible and stuff like that. But hey, if you want to be a literalist, then these words need to sink into your ears. I mean, no, you have to allow for context. You have to ask the question. When Jesus says, eat my flesh and drink my blood in John 6, had he already defined what that meant? Yes, he had. Many verses before, as coming and believing. That's how you do serious exegesis. That's how you listen to the text and let it speak for itself. All this, there's all these assumptions being made by this guy. I mean, think about it. If he was specifically referring to words from the Last Supper, Jesus is still with the apostles. The sacrifice hasn't taken place yet. And yet Rome has gone so far as to say that Jesus actually performed the miracle of transubstantiation before his sacrifice. Didn't know that? Yes. And in fact, they teach that Jesus ordained the apostles as priests when he said to them at the supper, do this in remembrance of me. Do this is an imperative, it's a command. And the only way you can do that is if you're a priest and have the power of transubstantiation. Now, that is so far removed from anything that ever crossed the mind of any apostle, any apostolic writer, anybody in the early church, that it's astonishing. But that's the dogma of Rome. That's what they teach. And so, I remember the first time I ran into that was when Mitch Pack was throwing it out at our debate as first or second. That was the second or third debate that I had fourth or fifth debate that I had even done. And so that's how seriously it's taken. That is a massive amount of later development being anachronistically read back into the text. And that is not respecting the text to allow that kind of later development to be determinative of what it's actually stating. That's completely different. So there's so much of that kind of stuff out there, and so many of our folks, wouldn't know who Cardinal Bellarmine was. But then again, most Roman Catholics today don't either.